Matthew Janner for Card Runners, and I'm here with Button and Blind Play Part 2, where we're going to be focusing on playing the button on the flop. So I first want to go over an outline for the video, because the first thing we're going to be discussing is the theory behind flop, button versus blind play in single raise pots, but we can break that down into sort of three sections. The first is, why does the big blind almost always check to the button? Why does the button bet on the flop so often? And should we try to use ratios when we're on the button? And what I mean by that is there a certain sort of like value betting to bluffing ratio we're going to be trying to, utilize on the flop when we're in the position on the button and deciding whether or not to bet? So we're going to talk about that quite a bit. And then in a similar style to the SSNL You're Doing It Wrong series, we'll go over a ton of positional button spots. So I just want to talk about a lot of the spots that I think are easy bets, easy checks, and then a lot of the spots that I think are really close. So hopefully after we go over a bunch of spots, you'll feel more comfortable when you're actually playing, knowing whether or not to bet or check, or knowing whether or not it's really close and you should look at your HUD, or it might not matter much either way. And starting off, we're going to need to think back to preflop. Recall that in the first video, the button opened about 45% of all possible hands, and the big blind called with a very wide range. This was justified because the big blind was getting better than 3-to-1 immediate odds and closed the action preflop. So when the big blind cold called the button open, he knows that he can't get squeezed because he's the last person to act. And if you remember, we assumed the button was min-raising, so that means the big blind's getting 3.5-to-1 immediate odds, which is just an insanely good price. Remember, the big blind called with the goal of simply losing less than one big blind overall for the hand, with many hands in the big blind cold calling range. This resulted in the big blind calling with some pretty crappy hands. I already showed the range last week, but the big blind is calling with some terrible, terrible hands. Like, I think I have the big blind calling with hands like Queen 5 off, because even though, when the big blind cold calls with Queen 5 off against the button open, the big blind's, of course, expecting to overall lose money for the hand, but he expects to lose less money than he would have if he just folded preflop. He's getting a really, really good price, so that lets him sort of justify his call preflop. So what does this tell us about donk betting? Well, if the big blind has a weaker range than the button, he's going to have a hard time donk betting anything. Remember, nothing magical happens when someone donk bets. Ranges matter, not initiative. So what I mean by that is, who has a stronger range is obviously very important for deciding who should be betting. Who has position is very important. Who has initiative doesn't actually matter. Initiative is not like position. Position has a very real value that you can even calculate in a lot of spots, whereas initiation doesn't have any real value. A lot of people think initiative should have value like position, but it actually doesn't. Optimal poker does not care what the previous action was on earlier streets. It only cares about the current ranges now. So the previous action can, of course, tell us what hands are in each player's range, but that's why we care about the previous action, not because there's any inherent value to having, been the preflop raiser. Okay, so here's how I like to visualize betting. I don't always bet, but when I do, it's because if I never bet, my checking range will be too strong. If I check with too strong of a checking range, my opponent won't bet at a high frequency, and it would have been more plus EV for me to have bet a strong hand than have checked with it. So what I really want you to take out of this is a lot of times people sort of bet all their good hands, and then they think like, okay, how do I make sure I'm not checking too weak of a range? That's one way to look at it, but I think it's better to sort of visualize it like betting is a luxury. You bet when you know that if you were to check everything, your checking range would be too strong. So because of that, you're better off, betting some of your strong hands, because that prevents your checking range from being too strong. So then now when you check, your opponent will still bet reasonably often. So if you are check calling with a strong hand, or if you are check raising, you're still going to get paid pretty well. So you didn't need to have bet that strong hand yourself. So again, you bet when you're out of position, because if you didn't, your checking range would be too strong and you wouldn't really be able to get value because your opponent would not be betting very often into your strong range. Once your checking range out of position is weak, then it starts making sense to start checking some really strong hands, because now your opponent's going to bet pretty often. All right, but what if the big blind doesn't bet? If the big blind never donk bets, does his checking range get too strong? For most board textures, probably not. It's likely not even close on many board textures. The button's range is too strong relative to the big blind's range, and position is valuable. This is not what I used to think, but people used to call with much, much stronger ranges preflop. When calling with much wider ranges preflop, donk betting isn't as effective. So if you look at my old series where I talk about donk betting, back in the day, people used to open the button much wider than I think most people would recommend now. And then people used to call in the blinds with way tighter ranges than people would now. So if you're still one of those players that's calling with like a lot of king, queen, queen, jack, king 10 stuff when you're out of position, and the button's opening a really, really wide range, then yeah, the big blind's range is probably going to be really strong on the flop relative to the buttons, and it will maybe make sense for the big blind to donk bet on a lot of board textures. But with the ranges we're using, where we assume the button min raises, and we 3-bet from the big blind very, very aggressively, and then called with a lot of really weak hands because we were getting such a good price pre-flop, it's not usually going to make sense to have a donk betting range. Our range is just too weak relative to the opponents. Understand, then visualize this. Remember, all GTO play is about always taking the most plus EV line. That's it. If we never donk bet, it's not because we want to balance something or do anything fancy. It's just because we think checking is more profitable than betting. Likewise, if we bet, it's just because we think betting is more profitable than checking. Models, frequencies, etc. just help give us a starting point for what the most plus EV lines are. So always remember, an optimal player always takes the most profitable line against an optimal opponent. That's always fundamentally what we're going to be doing. Balance is never the goal. Balance is just a byproduct of always taking the most profitable line in spots. So let's start off with this situation. Imagine I open in the button and you 3-bet me in the big blind and I call your 3-bet. The flop comes king 9-6 with 2 clubs and you check your entire range here. What's my counter strategy? So imagine you're playing 3-bet pots the same way you're playing single raise pots, where when you're out of position, you check your entire range. So what would my counter strategy be if I opened the button, you 3-bet me and I called, the flop comes king high and I know you're checking your entire range? Well, my counter strategy is going to be to check back at a really high frequency. Your range is too strong for me to justify betting most hands. And think about this. If I open in the button and you 3-bet me in the big blind, I know that I'm getting a really good price when I call preflop and I have the advantage of position. Whereas if you're 3-betting, you're going to be 3-betting a lot of like ace king, queen king, pocket aces, king jack hands that do very well on this board texture. So if you're not betting here against me, your checking range is going to be way too strong. So I'm going to go, there's no way I'm going to bet aggressively into that checking range because I know you're planning on check calling and check raising too aggressively against me because you have too many strong hands. So think about it. Are we at an equilibrium here, or does the player clearly have an incentive to change? What should you do with most of your premium hands and good bluff randomizers instead of checking them? Well, you should bet them. This allows you to get more value and weakens your checking range, so I'll bet more often and you check call and check raise bluff some hands effectively. So all this is saying is if your checking range is too strong against me, I can exploit you by checking back a whole lot because I know I'm not going to get many folds when I do bet. And then you should adjust by realizing that when I check back at a high frequency, you're now better off when you're betting with your strong hands because there's going to be more value in betting than there is in check calling or check raising. Likewise, once you start betting a lot of your really good hands, then now when you check to me on this king 9-6 board, now I might start debating, betting with my gut shots in my more marginal pairs because I'm thinking to myself like, okay, my opponent's not going to be check raising or check calling at that high of a frequency. So now it's more tempting for me to bet a hand that's maybe on the border. Let's try another situation. So suppose I open in the button and you call in the big blind. The flop comes 7 of clubs, 5 of clubs, 2 of hearts. And you check your entire range to me here. What's my counter strategy? So what should I do if I know you're checking your entire big blind cold calling range to me on this 7-5-2 board with 2 clubs? Well, I don't really have a counter strategy. Your range will still be weak and I don't really want to give free cards, so I'm still going to bet this flop at a very high frequency, probably close to 100%. So what should you be doing with your premium hands, sets, 2 pairs, etc.? Does any player have an incentive to change here? So probably not. You should check raise most of your strong hands because you know I'll likely bet. You don't have enough strong hands to prevent me from betting aggressively even if you check your entire range. So here, all I'm getting at is if you check your entire range to me and you're in the big blind here, it's not really going to slow me down from betting, because I know even if you check all of your strong hands in this button versus big blind situation, you just didn't have that many strong hands to begin with. And on top of that, if you look at this board texture, this 752 board, this is a board texture where I don't really want to give you a bunch of free cards when I'm on the button. You know, if I have a pair of sevens, I'm going to want to bet. If I have pocket eights, I'm going to want to bet. I'm probably even going to want to bet like a lot of my ace high hands or my 5x hands. There's some hands that are debatable, but for the most part, I'm going to want to be betting this flop at a very high frequency. So when you do have your strong hands, when you do have two pairs, when you do have sets, there's no reason to donk bet them. You're better off just check raising them yourself. And then, of course, everything needs to, if you are going to donk bet, you need to have a balanced range. So if you were going to check raise all of, your sets in two pairs, it doesn't make sense to only just bet, to donk bet with some random pairs of sevens, because then I'm going to be able to bluff raise you on this flop very, very effectively. So here, I think the big blind should be checking pretty much his entire range on this flop, and then the big blind is going to want to check raise a lot of the really good hands. It can slow play some hands, but a lot of the really good hands, and then of course bluffs are going to want to be check raised on this flop. So I know these are pretty simple examples, but hopefully you could understand why in the first situation, when the big blind 3-bets, it would be absolutely terrible if he checked his entire range on the flop, because his range is really, really strong relative to the button's cold calling range. But here, when the button opens and the big blind calls, on a lot of board textures, the vast, vast majority, I'd say, the big blind is going to want to be checking almost his entire range on the flop, because here the big blind's range is just much weaker than the button opening range. So the big blind just really doesn't want to bet the strong hands because he knows he's going to be able to check raise them a lot. So hopefully you can see why in the first situation, the big blind needs to be betting very aggressively, whereas in the second situation, the big blind should probably never be betting on the flop. So why does the button bet so frequently? First off, you're probably betting too frequently on the button. Chances are you're a button betting glutton. There's a few reasons for this. Betting with any two cards is very frequently profitable for the button, both in theory and especially in practice. Again, it's hard to learn to take a very profitable line when another line is already profitable. Your brain sucks at that. So, if you keep betting in a spot that is negative EV to bet, I have a lot of faith in most people learning relatively quickly that they shouldn't be betting in that spot. You, of course, are going to need a pretty big sample. You're going to need to try to objectively analyze your play. But for the most part, if you bet in a spot 100 times and overall it hasn't worked out, you've lost money, chances are your brain's going to really make you think, maybe I shouldn't be betting there. But if you're getting a good outcome when you're betting, like you're usually winning money, you're usually, when you win money, you're usually happy. Your brain's not usually going to be very good at realizing that there's actually a better line. Because usually when you win money and you're happy, you just kind of move on to the next hand and you feel good. You don't start and think like, oh, wait a second, maybe I could have done something better. So what I mean by that is if there's a spot where if you bet the button, it's overall has a EV of plus $1. So it's, you win $1 on average when you bet on the button. You're probably not going to be very good at realizing that that dollar bet wasn't as good as checking, which might have been worth, had an EV of $2. So that's much harder for your brain to realize, so you want to go in understanding that. Also, betting usually makes the hand easier to play. People are really, really big on this at micro stakes and small stakes, because you kind of can win a lot of money just by not letting yourself get into tough spots. Again, it depends on the website and the limit. I'm not trying to make no limit 100 or no limit 200 stars to sound easier than they are now. Players have gotten much better. But still, people really try to emphasize lines that make the hand easier to play. And usually betting the button or betting the flop when you're on the button just makes the hand easy. You get folds probably about half the time right off the bat. And then if you just get a fold half the time, then boom, you're done. So people are very tempted to bet on the button or to bet on the flop from the button too much because they know, hey, half the time they're going to win the pot right there. Around half the time they'll win the pot right there. And then the hand's over. Whereas if they check, then now you have to worry about the big blind betting the turn. You have to actually make decisions. If the big blind does check, you might not know what to do because you might have already suggested weakness. So people also just straight up like to bet the flop because it makes the hand easier to play. And that's a habit we really, really want to avoid. Even if you're at really low limits, by starting to check back the button more often, you'll not only should you make more money, but you'll get better, which will allow you to move up quicker and be more comfortable when you do move up. So, despite what I've just said, the button usually should bet at a high frequency for a few reasons. Firstly, since both players' ranges are wide and weak, most hands in each player's range will have at least some equity. In other words, it's rare for any hand on the flop to have no equity. Any hand can make a pair, and a pair will often be good. And many hands can runner straights and flushes, which will usually win at showdown. So, like, a lot of times in, like, a 3-bet pot, especially if, like, someone 3-bet a middle position or under the gun opener, it's pretty hard to draw out when your opponent has a hand like pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket queens, something like that. But here it's button versus big blind. Even a weak pair is often going to win at showdown in a button versus big blind situation. So even if you don't flop a pair on the flop, if you turn a pair, it will very often be the best hand. Even if you don't turn top pair or second top pair, it will pretty often be the best hand because both players have a wide and weak range. So because of that, it gets very risky to give free cards. You know, if you give a free card in like a 3 or a 4-bet pot, it might not always be all that risky. But if you're giving free cards when both players have very weak ranges, then a turn pair will almost always be good, and it is pretty risky to give free cards. Secondly, the button's range is stronger. The stronger range will usually bet at a higher frequency. So I'll talk about this really briefly, but it should be pretty obvious. The stronger range will usually be betting more often. As we've already talked about, if you start checking too much with a strong range, your opponent has a very simple counter strategy, which is just to stop betting. So here, the button's in position. When the button checks back, he's going to effectively remove a street from the game because we're going to move right onto the turn. So that lets the big blind outdraw on the button, but also it prevents the button from getting 3 streets of value, and the button will have, you know, a good amount of like good aces, good top pairs, maybe even some good over pairs that want to get 3 streets of value most of the time. So you should expect the button to bet at a high frequency because he has the advantage of position, he has the stronger range, and he doesn't love giving free cards. So lastly, position is valuable. And since the button has a stronger range and position, he can bet at a pretty high frequency before his betting range will get too weak relative to the big blind's checking range. So in other words, the button's just saying, hey, I have this big advantage that I'm in position. I have the stronger range than you. I know I can bet at a really high frequency, and my opponent in the big blind's not really going to be able to exploit me because he just doesn't have the strong hands in his range to do it, and he's out of position, which is a pretty substantial disadvantage. So for all these reasons, you should expect the button to bet at a pretty high frequency, but again, most people are still betting the button at too high of a frequency because it does make the hand easier to play and because your brain is bad at realizing there is a more profitable line when you're already taking a profitable line. I'm going to go over this slide really fast because I know we're getting repetitive, but because the button has the stronger range, the advantage of position, and knows a lot of his good hands are vulnerable to being outdrawn, he's going to bet often. It's not much more complicated than that. Still, most players are making profitable bets when there are more profitable checks dozens of times per session. This isn't good, and that's going to be one of the most prominent leaks we try to fix during this video. So this throws off a lot of pretty good players, so let's briefly talk about using ratios. Most of you have probably seen how in my other videos I like to use a lot of ratios and frequencies that can be found using models. For the most part, I think they're very useful. That said, button versus big blind situations don't model particularly well for a couple of reasons. The first is there's very few nut type and air type hands in each player's range on the flop. Value hands constantly get outdrawn, and bluffs will constantly improve to the best hand. So, especially if you flop like the best hand with like a pair of 9s, 10s, jacks, 8s, stuff like that, it's pretty likely that your opponent outdraws you on the turn of the river. Likewise, if we're bluffing on the flop, whether we're bluffing with 3 to a flush and 3 to a straight, or with just some random cards, maybe an overcard or two, we're going to outdraw our opponent pretty often, even if he has the best hand. So because there's not a lot of like nut type and air type hands in each player's range, it makes this more difficult to model. Additionally, there are a lot of streets left to act, which means the model will be less accurate for non-perfectly polarized ranges. It's much easier to model the river than the turn, and much easier to model the turn than the flop. Here we're on the flop, so models are just straight up going to be less accurate. There's a lot of turn and river combinations that can come, and because there's still 2 streets left to act. And then the last one, which is a really, really big one, is very often we'll be betting with the intention of only betting 1 or 2 streets for value. This is harder to model, especially when you're only betting 1 street for value, because then we bet the flop, check the turn, and then our opponent gets an opportunity to bet on the river if he wants. So this makes it much, much more difficult to model. So these are all problems with trying to use ratios and frequencies when you're doing button versus big blind ranges. Cool. So models in theory are useless, right? Nope. In my opinion, models in theory kick ass. But let's just play it fast and loose and remember what the models told us. We want to bluff a really lot on the flop, a medium amount on the turn, and not too much on the river. This is probably the most important thing that we've really learned from the models, and that if we're betting on the flop, we want our flop betting range to include a really, really lot of bluffs, because especially if we're betting a reasonably polarized range, which a lot of the times we will be, even in button versus big blind situations, we can bluff a lot on the flop, and then we just bluff a little bit less on the turn and a little bit less on the river, and then by the time we've bet the river, we actually have a balanced range. On the river, we can't bluff all that much because we're giving our opponent a really, really good price. Even if we bet a pot-sized bet on the river, our opponent's still getting 2-to-1 odds. So we can't bluff all that much on the river because our opponent's getting such a good price and there's no more additional streets left to act. Likewise, we can bluff a medium amount on the turn because there's only one street left to act, and we can bluff the most on the flop because there's 2 streets left to act. We want to consider betting big when the opponent can't raise us. This is a really, really good general rule of thumb to just keep in mind. You don't always want to overbet when the opponent can't raise or won't raise, because sometimes sometimes he won't raise even if he can because he'll delay his raise to a later street. But when the opponent's not going to be raising, you want to at least consider overbetting, especially in the case when the opponent just has no strong hands in his range. So we're still going to be doing that a lot in button versus blind situations. This is going to happen more often on the turn and the river, but it can still happen on the flop. And another really important thing to remember is it's usually best to bet medium strength hands on the flop if they're likely to be outdrawn by hands in the opponent's check folding range. So a medium strength hand can usually only bet 1 or 2 streets for value effectively, because if we bet all 3 streets, we'll make our opponent's range too strong by the river. So one thing that's tricky is knowing whether or not you should bet the medium strength hand on the flop and make the opponent fold some hands, or if you should check back a medium strength hand on the flop, because that gives the opponent a better opportunity to bluff on the turn. Well, I think the answer to that is if the medium strength hand is likely to be outdrawn by hands in the opponent's check folding range, then you're going to be more likely to want to bet the flop because you want to make those hands that can outdraw you fold. If your hand's not likely to be outdrawn, then you're going to be more likely to want to check back because you can give your opponent a free card and you don't really have to worry about being outdrawn at a very high frequency. And this gives your opponent the chance to improve and then call a bet that with a losing hand, or it just gives him a chance to bluff. So I just kind of mentioned this, but it's usually best to check medium strength hands on the flop, which aren't particularly vulnerable to being outdrawn. This lets the opponent bluff. And what I forgot to mention is it also prevents him from being able to check raise us on the flop. So it sucks when we have a marginal strength hand and we bet it on the flop and our opponent check raises us, because now we put in that additional bet on the flop and now we have a bluff catcher against our opponent's polarized range and there's still 3 streets left to act. There's still a flop, turn, and river. So it's a lot better if we were to just check back the flop, because now we've removed a street from the game and we didn't let our opponent get that chance to check raise us. So that's another big advantage of checking back in medium strength hands, which aren't particularly vulnerable to being outdrawn, is we don't have to worry about getting check raised. So hopefully after talking about theory in other videos and showing models in other videos that are oversimplified for this situation, you can still remember that this general theory is going to be the most important stuff to keep in mind. And it seems very simple right now, but unless you're a really good player, you're probably making a lot of mistakes that don't really make sense in context of understanding this theory. So that's what we're really going to be looking for as we go ahead and go to the rest of the video where we start doing examples. So for the rest of the video, we're going to kind of play it fast and loose, and we're going to do the following. We're going to look at some flop textures and talk about them for a minute. So I want to just give you a general sense of what goes through my mind when I see a different flop texture in a button versus big blind situation. We want to talk about how much does it favor position and how well does it hit each player's range. Especially this first part, how much does it favor position is very, very important. There's some board textures where it's just really, really good to be in position, and others where it matters significantly less. We also want to try to figure out which hands make easy bets or checks on the flop and which hands are close. I'll quiz you on this throughout the video. I, of course, don't know what the EV of a bet or what the EV of a check is in any spot, but I can tell you what I think, and by telling you which spots I think are close and which spots I think are easy, hopefully that will give you sort of a better frame of reference to work with when you're deciding whether to bet or check yourself. A lot of you guys are going to have the advantage of using a HUD when you play. So if I've told you this spot I think is close for all these reasons, that should hopefully set off a little thought process in your mind when you're playing a hand to think, oh, if you get in this spot, it's close. So bring up the HUD and see if you want to bet or check against this specific opponent. Whereas if I think it's a really easy bet or a really easy check, well, if you're playing a lot of tables at once, you're not going to bring up a HUD for something that you're pretty sure you already know what you're going to want to do. So if it's a spot where you're going to want to check 99% of the time, you're just going to check it without looking at your HUD. I'll likely write out my entire range in some spots in future videos. It's super time consuming and not our goal for this video. So I am going to probably make a couple videos where I write out what I would do with my entire range on the flop. It's not something I'm looking forward to doing because it's really time consuming, but you tend to learn a lot from doing that. So I will make that video soon, but for right now, we're doing more of the quiz stuff. We're doing more of the, hey, let's get the basic spots down. Let's get the close spots down. And then for actually writing out every single hand, there'll be a message text for that, but we'll do that in a future video. So this video should be quite a bit easier to watch than that one will be. And for one last friendly reminder, when deciding whether to bet or check, constantly ask yourself, does betting allow my hand to retain equity? If I bet, do I mostly just make hands I beat, which aren't that likely to outdraw me fold? And if I check, can I keep dominated hands in my opponent's range? Think before you answer. You're likely just clicking buttons in a lot of spots, and our goal is to find some of them in the next 30 minutes. All right, hand number one. We open the button and the big blind calls. The flop comes ace of spades, king of clubs, eight of spades. The big blind checks, and the big blind is going to check in every single example we do today. So we're always going to assume we're on the button and the big blind checks. So what are some easy value flop bets? So you're going to want to have your finger on your mouse so you can pause this video a lot for the next 30 minutes. So just be sure that if you have the time, pause the video and then answer the questions before I give my thoughts. So what are some easy value bets on the flop? I have pocket eights, ace king, ace queen to ace 10. And you would also add in like ace 8 here. So these are just some examples. It doesn't mean every single one. But for the most part, the point I'm trying to get across is the big blind's range is pretty much capped at ace 9 off. And when I say ace 9 off, I should mean it like this. The big blind will have some ace 8 hands, so we'll have 9 combos of 2 pair, and we'll have 3 combos of pocket eights. But when I say it's capped at ace 9, I mean that's when you hit the point where the big blind has like ace 9 off, then ace 7 off, then ace 6 off, then ace 5 off, then ace 4 off. So it's like ace 9 off is where you start seeing your opponent have a lot of hands that are that strong and just a little bit weaker than that. So for the most part, anything that's like, I'd even bet like ace 9 here very, very easily on the button. But like all these hands that I've selected, these hands are just very, very rarely beat because they require our opponent to have flopped a set or 2 pair to have them beat, and that's very unlikely. So we're going to want to probably bet all these hands for usually 3 streets of value. There's some turn and river combinations that would make us slow down, but for the most part, you're going to bet these for 3 streets most of the time. Maybe you'll have to bet a little bit smaller if a spade comes, but you probably can get 3 streets in. All right, what are some easy flop checks? I would say probably any king X and then queens to jacks. Like these just, betting right here on the flop with these hands just isn't going to be that effective. We're not vulnerable to being outdrawn with king X. We're not that vulnerable to being outdrawn with queens or jacks. And we don't really want to get check raised, and we can't bet all 3 streets and get 3 streets of value. So it'd be very unlikely that I bet any king on this flop or queens or jacks. So why not bet these hands? I probably just said that, but I don't fear giving a free card, and I don't want to get check raised. And then what hands can check raise us here for the button? Or sorry, for the big blind. So what hands can the big blind have that will want to check raise us here? Pause for a moment and think. But it's going to be hands like ace 8, king 8, pocket eights, and that makes up 21 combos. So I actually forgot king 8 earlier when I was, I make these slides like a week before I do the recording sometimes, and that's what happened here. So these are 21 value combos, ace 8, or 9 eights, 8 combos, 9 king 8 combos, and 3 pocket 8 combos. I'm not positive off the top of my head, but I think if you remember, we did cold call in the big blind with ace 8 and ace 7 suited, I think. So yeah, so it'll be 9 combos of ace 8, 9 of king 8, and 3 of pocket 8. So that makes it 21 combos. But not just these hands are going to check raise. The big blind should also check raise his some draws and some bluffs. So you will get check raised on this board by a good opponent in the big blind. So don't just think if you're going to be betting hands like king X or ace 4 or ace 5 because they're easy, that you're never going to get check raised. A strong opponent will check raise you here at a reasonable frequency. So we're still working on this flop. What are some easy flop bet bluffs? So what hands do you think are kind of easy, like obvious bluffs on this flop that the button should be bluffing with? Well, I have Jack 10, Queen 10, 10 9, 9 7, Jack X of clubs, etc. Like a lot of let's go over each one of these hands. Jack 10 and Queen 10 are gut shots, and then 10 9 and 9 7 are 3 to a straight. So all these hands will Jack 10 and Queen 10 can just straight up turn the nuts. But even 10 9 and 9 7, let's talk about 9 7. When we have 9 7, both a 9 and a 7 turn us a pair, and that's 6 cards that turn us a pair. Then 8 cards turn us to open-ended straight draw. So even a hand like 9 7, even if it's doesn't have a runner flush, so if it's 9 7 offsuit with no spade, even that hand will actually turn the open-ended straight draw reasonably often. So here, since there aren't a lot of hands that have overcards, we need some bluffs that don't have a ton of equity. I think 9 7 and 10 9 are going to work really well here because they'll straight up just about a fifth of the time turn the open-ended straight draw, which barrels very well. Likewise, Jack X of clubs is very similar. Jack X of clubs, when we turn a club, we're just going to be able to double barrel very cleanly. If we turn a jack, we'll probably check back. So I think these hands are all really good bluffs, and if you're playing a bunch of tables at once, I would bet all these hands without much thought. So yeah, now my emphasis on 3 to straight. I can turn 8 open-ended straight draws, 8 gut shots, and 6 pairs. So there are a lot of turn cards when you bet something like 9 7 that will give you some sort of draw. Obviously, the open-ended straight draw is the best, but even a gut shot's likely workable. Sometimes you're going to double barrel that, and then pairs can sometimes be the best hand, or they can just run a run or 2 pair of trips. What would you do with the following and why? These are some tricky spots. So I'm intentionally asking hands where I think it's close, and obviously when I think it's close, it's much more likely I'll be wrong. But again, no one actually knows what's theoretically correct. So when I say I'm wrong, it's not something that's probably provable, but there's a chance that I say something here that a lot of people will disagree with because no one knows. But I want to ask the close spots because those are often the more interesting spots. And you're going to learn a lot more if we do close stuff as well as easy stuff. Because if we just do the easy stuff, then when you're actually playing, things can easily get trickier. And you might freak out a bit because stuff that seems simple in a video is actually a lot harder when you're trying to play, you're getting close spots, and you're having a bunch of hands that you need to play at once. Okay, so here we go. So Queen 9 off. Would you bet this or check this? Okay, and I didn't write an explanation, I'll have to go over each one. So Queen 9 off, I'd probably actually check back. It's close-ish to the nut non-pair hand, as weird as it is, because the opponent might have some Queen 9 and Queen 10 in his range. But for the most part, this is kind of the nut non-pair hand. And if we check back something like Queen 9 off, we can turn a 9 and that might be the best pair. We can turn a queen that might be the best pair. So if we bet something like Queen 9 off, not only do we pretty much never get to use our showdown value, and it's going to be hard to use the showdown value of Queen 9 anyways, but people make mistakes and let us sometimes show down with a hand like this and win if we do check back. But what I'm getting at is, if we check Queen 9 and the turn card comes a queen, we might beat our opponent's Queen 5. But if we bet Queen 9 on the flop, we just make our opponent fold their Queen 5. So, when we bet Queen 9, our opponent's probably not folding his Queen 10. He's not folding his Queen Jack if he can have it. He's probably folding some Queen 9s, and he's probably folding everything worse than Queen 9. So it doesn't seem like we really retain our equity that well by betting Queen 9 off here. And we need some hands that are going to fold to our opponent when he bets the turn. We don't want to be the guy that only checks back this range right here. King X, Queens, and Jacks. Don't be that guy. That is not effective against good opponents because they'll know when you check back this Ace, King, 8 board that you probably have something that's not going to want to fold to a turn bet. Because, most people just always bet the flop with their pure air hands if they think it's profitable. So it helps to actually check back some hands like Queen 9 off because, again, Queen 9 off does have some showdown value. It does keep some dominated hands in the opponent's range. And it gives us a hand that can fold if our opponent bets the turn, or we can bluff it ourselves later if we need to. So, yeah, I would check Queen 9 off. How about Queen 8? So Queen 8 makes a pair, but I would still probably check it back. Because, again, if the turn card comes like a queen, when we check back the flop, we keep our opponents Queen 4s, Queen 5s, Queen 6s in his range. And since there is an overcard with Queen 8, I don't love giving a free card with Queen 8. Obviously a 9, 10, and a Jack are all bad turns. But since there are effectively 4 overcards, the 9, 10, Jack, and Queen, it does help that we have one of those overcards. Obviously, the Queen on the turn is good. And then likewise, with Queen 8, I just think we're going to be value betting ourselves a lot of the time, meaning we'll bet Queen 8, but our opponent will have a king or will have an ace. So we might end up, just putting more money in the pot than we want to. And also, when we bet and get check raised, that kind of sucks. So queen 8, I think, is close because, again, I don't love giving free cards here, but I think I'd rather just check it back because queen 8 can win at showdown. Maybe we can get one small bet in somewhere and get a little bit more value if we think our opponent has, like, you know, a weaker pair of 8s at some point. But for the most part, I'd rather just kind of try to get a showdown with queen 8 rather than make the pot bigger and risk getting check raised. But again, this one's close and it's hard to tell. And if you're against a really weak opponent, I think you actually can bet queen 8 because then you can just confidently bet fold. As you start playing closer to, you know, GTO, it's a lot harder to bet fold because you just have to defend so much of your betting range. So in that case, I think you'd want to check back queen 8. How about 9-8? Well, 9-8 I think is closer to a check than queen 8 is because when you bet queen 8 on the flop, you can at least get more value from the opponent's jack 8s, 10-8s, and 9-8s. But with 9-8, you're again value betting yourself. So 9-8 I would more confidently check back because, again, if the opponent has jack 8 and we have 9-8, we might just check it down all the way and then we don't lose any more money. Whereas if we had queen 8 and we checked it down all the way, we would have lost one value bet. So again, it's really hard to tell here. I'm intentionally picking like tricky hands, but I would say check the queen 9 off. The queen 8 is closest, but I would still probably lean slightly towards checking it. And 9-8 is also close, but I would more strongly feel about checking 9-8 because 9-8, you know, loses value when our opponent has 10-8 and jack 8, whereas queen 8 gains value by betting when our opponent has jack 8 or 10-8 or 9-8. And then 5s. 5s I would most confidently check back because this hand just doesn't retain its equity. So if we bet pocket 5s and our opponent ends up floating on the flop, you know, like calling with a gut shot or something out of position, he's probably going to bluff us off the 5s on the river. Whereas if we bet 5s, we kind of just make our opponent fold a bunch of hands that we beat. I mean, those hands are going to outdraw pocket 5s, but for the most part, when we bet 5s, we make the opponent fold hands that we beat. And then 5s just don't retain their equity. They're not likely to outdraw the opponent when we're ahead. Sorry, they're not likely to outdraw the opponent when we're behind. And then when we are ahead, our opponent will outdraw us reasonably often. But more importantly, even when we are ahead and our opponent calls, he'll be able to bluff us off the best hand later. So I don't think 5s retain their equity very well. I would just check it back and hope we can either win at showdown or use 5s as a bluff later if we need to. All right, so let's do the next hand. So now let's say the flop is 10-8-5 with 2 spades. So let's get some examples of some flop value bets that can hopefully bet all 3 streets. So again, pause for a moment and think like, what hands can you usually bet all 3 streets on this board? Obviously, it's going to depend on the turn in the river card, but what hands can often bet all 3 streets? Well, that's going to be like queen 10 plus, over pairs, sets, and 2 pair. So again, the reason why I wrote queen 10 plus here is because when we start looking at like the offsuit combos our opponent can have jack 10 off. He can have 10-9 off. He can have at least 10-7 suited. I don't remember if he could have 10-7 off. So yeah, our opponent can have us beat when we have queen 10, but in order for our opponent to have our queen 10 beat, our opponent needs to have either a set or 2 pair, and those are just pretty rare. So definitely want to bet queen 10 off or better here. Now, this is a board texture that's pretty risky to give free cards. So how about hands that can only value bet once, maybe twice, but you think should bet the flop? So I want examples of hands that you feel like, hey, I want to bet the flop here, but I don't think I'm going to be able to bet all 3 streets. And remember, you're going to want to bet the flop here with a lot of hands that are vulnerable to being outdrawn by hands in your opponent's check folding range. So pause for a moment and think. But I have hands like ace 8, king 8, queen 8, and 9s. Again, remember, if our opponent has like a marginalish 8 on the flop, then we want to get we'll get value if we bet with like ace 8 or king 8 because we'll have them outkicked. Whereas if we had a weaker 8 ourselves and our opponent has, let's say, 8-9, then when we bet, 8-6 or 8-7 on the flop, we're value betting, like we're doing the opposite of value betting. Now we're putting money into the pot when we're behind. So again, if our opponent had a hand like 8-9, we're glad we bet with ace 8, king 8, queen 8. But if we had a hand like 8-6 or 8-7 and our opponent has 8-9, then by betting the flop, we just put more money in when we're behind. 9s I also think are going to be a pretty solid value bet for this exact same reason. We can maybe make our opponent fold some overcards. And when I say overcards, I don't mean a hand with 2 overcards. He's not going to fold a hand with 2 overcards. He doesn't even have many. But he would probably fold like maybe some king 3 suited or something like that, or some king 7 suited or something like that might fold. And then our opponent can't outdraw us by hitting a runner straight or making a pair of kings on the turn. So I would definitely bet 9s because we can make some overcards fold, and we make sure we get value from all the opponent's 8s and 5s. So what are some hands that are flop checks that will often call turn bets? So what hands are we checking back on the flop that we're likely going to call on the turn with? So pause for a moment and think. And this one's tough. So pause. I have ace king, ace queen, ace jack, 8-7, and 9-8. This one's tougher and more debatable. Now, the reason why I like checking back ace king, ace queen, and ace jack is, again, if we bet these hands on the flop, we're not going to be able to utilize their showdown value so effectively, because if our opponent does call with a hand we have that we beat on the flop with ace king or ace queen, our opponent's likely going to end up bluffing on the river and make us fold the better hand. The other thing that's nice about checking something like ace king and ace queen is just how I was talking about how we can make our opponent, fold random king sixes, king sevens, probably not king nine, but king seven, king six, queen six, all those kind of hands that we can get our opponent to sort of fold if we bet the flop. With ace king, that's not that important, because if our opponent has king seven and we have ace king, we don't really need to make king seven fold. Ideally, we want to check back the flop and then the king comes on the turn. Always remember how significant it is. A lot of people think well, it's not that likely that you have ace king and the opponent has king seven and then we check back and the turn card comes king. That's true. But if I have ace king and my opponent has king seven, he has 3 outs, which are the 7, and then there's 2 cards, which are the kings, which mean if the king turns, we're going to probably win a medium-sized pot. Whereas if our opponent just has, 6 outs to a pair that can beat us, that's twice as many outs as he has in an ace king versus king seven situation. So it's not just that, sometimes we'll get lucky and turn a king when it's ace king versus king seven, but it's also just that when we have ace king and the opponent has king seven, even if the turn card doesn't come a king, it's super unlikely we get outdrawn. So that's also why I like checking back these hands. Ace king, ace queen, ace jack, they have showdown value if we check them back, and then we keep the hands we dominate in the opponent's range, so we're not that likely to be outdrawn, and then sometimes we're just going to get lucky and outkick the opponent on the turn. 8-7 and 9-8, these are closer, and if you're playing against weak opponents, you might even just want to bet them, but what I was talking about before is if our opponent has a queen 8 or a king 8 or a jack 8 hand, we want to bet these 8s, the ace 8, the king 8, the queen 8, because we'll get value. Whereas with 8-7 and 9-8, we're not getting value, we're putting money in with the worst hand. And at least in the case of 9-8, the cool thing about checking back 9-8 is we're very comfortable on any jack turn or 9 turn, or 7, but 7's not overcard to the 8. So what I'm getting at is what are the cards that are higher than an 8? There's a 9, there's a jack, there's a queen, there's a king, and there's an ace. So there are 5 cards that are higher than an 8 that can turn, that make new sort of pairs higher than an 8. But when we have 9-8, obviously the 9 gives us 2 pair. And then even if the turn card comes a jack, yeah, we might have gotten outdrawn on the jack turn, but now we also have a open-ended straight draw. So that's the other cool thing about checking back 9-8 is the only really bad turn cards when we check back 9-8 are the queen, the king, and the ace. And even the queen gives us a jack for the gut shot. So I would prefer to check back 9-8 against someone good, whereas if I'm playing against a weaker opponent, I'd probably just go ahead and bet it. All right. So the flop is still that. Let's try some tough ones. Not that the last ones weren't tough, but how would you do the following? 6s and 7s. Okay, so with 6s and 7s, it's tricky. Because if we bet them, it's hard to really get value that effectively. We'll often bet the flop, turn will go check, check, and then we'll have to face a river bet. But especially with a hand like pocket 6s, we don't really want to give free cards. Because like if we have pocket 6s, for example, and our opponent has king 7, he has 6 outs. So I tend to lean towards betting the 6s and the 7s. We might want to bet it might make sense to have some hands in our range that bet the flop, check the turn, and call the river, depending on the turn and river combination. So 6s and 7s can kind of fit that role. Again, you have to remember, 6s and 7s are pretty much going to be a bluff catcher on the river against a good opponent. Our opponent's not really going to be bluffing. If we have pocket 7s, our opponent's not going to be bluffing with a pair of 8s or better on pretty much any runner-runner turn and river combination for the most part. So it's possible we bet 6s and 7s for sort of on the flop, hope our opponent calls with an ace high or a pair of 5s and checks it down. And then, sometimes we end up hero calling if we bet the flop, turn goes check, check, and he bets the river. So I probably lean towards betting these hands, but I don't hate checking them either. I think they're really close, but I would probably prefer to bet them. 6-5 suited. So 6-5 suited is another good example, but it's pretty much falls into the same category as pocket 6s, only it's a little bit weaker. 6-5 suited is unhappy when we bet and our opponent had king 5 or queen 5 or jack 5, whereas pocket 6 is happy if we bet and our opponent had those hands. So I think I would, again, it's I'm really tempted to bet these. It's hard to even talk about them because I intentionally chose the hard ones. But I'm tempted to bet 6-5 suited here because I don't want to give a bunch of free cards. And I think against most opponents that I'm playing against, I would probably bet it. But I think against a really strong opponent, you want to check 6-5. And the other thing you want to keep in mind is if you check 6-5, there's a lot of turn cards that can give us additional draw. So if like the turn card comes like a 9, then the 7 will give us a straight on the river. If the turn card comes a 7, then we have a open-ended straight draw, right? Right, 5, 6, 7, 8. So if the turn card comes a 7, we will have a straight draw. So yeah, with 6-5 suited, I think against opponents that don't really check raise bluff, you probably can get away with betting it and be pretty happy about it. But against players that will check raise bluff and will maybe make some really thin value check raises if you're betting the flop too lightly, then I think it's okay to check back 6-5 suited. Ace-9. So Ace-9, in my opinion, is actually a, pause for a moment if you want, but I think that's actually a really easy flop check. Like Ace-9, we're not going to make our opponent fold any better hands. The hand doesn't retain its equity well. We can just check back the flop with Ace-9, feel pretty good if we turn an Ace or a 9, and we can call probably if we turn a Jack or a 7 as well. So with Ace-9, I think that's probably a pretty easy flop check. So hopefully most of you guys got that one. Ace-4 of clubs. So this one I think would be a flop bet because it has some very robust equity in case a runner-runners the straight. We maybe can make our opponent fold like an Ace-6 or Ace-7 on the flop if we bet. So we can maybe make our opponent fold some hands that beat us. And we can also just double barrel the club very effectively. So Ace-4 of clubs, I would go ahead and bet it. Whereas Ace-9, I would feel like it's pretty confident with checking it. And then King-Queen. King-Queen is also, I think, a really tough one. Actually, on second thought, I think I would just go ahead and bet it. Even though I really, really hate getting check raised when I bet King-Queen. Especially if we have like a spade. Oh, it sucks to get check raised there. Because we're probably going to have to float it, to be honest. But the good thing about betting King-Queen is if the turn card comes a queen or a king, we can keep value betting pretty effectively. The turn card comes a jack, we turn an awesome draw. The turn card comes a 9, we turn a gut shot, and we can keep betting aggressively. And then we can just make our opponent fold some aces on the flop. So I think for all those reasons, I'd go ahead and bet King-Queen. Though the reason why I thought it might be really close at first, which now I'm starting to disagree with, is it really, really does suck to get check raised, but I think overall it's still worth the risk to go ahead and just bet it on the flop because it does get value so effectively when we turn a king or a queen, and it can double barrel so well on certain like 9 and jack turn cards. All right, so those were tough. This is a hard board texture that really favors being in position since it's so wet, and like with those hands that I just went over, you can tell how I intentionally chose the hands that I think are close. It's kind of a struggle. So if you do get hands like this, I would really recommend you like pull up your HUD if you are able to use a HUD and see if you think it's the right opponent to bet against. Because, the Ace-4 of clubs I think is a pretty easy bet. I think the Ace-9 is a pretty easy check. But especially with the other hands, it can make sense to do different things with them. So be willing to use your HUD and just understand that there's a lot of really close spots which are just tough. Hand number 3. So the flop is 6 of spades, 5 of spades, 2 of clubs. List some hands, list some easy bets and easy checks, then some close bets and close checks. You can pause for a moment and think of those if you'd like. Do you have them? A lot of you are probably aware that this is a trick question. So this is a board where I think I should bet my entire range. And I want to explain pretty briefly. So if we're on the button here and the flop comes 6-5-2, this board hits the button range very, very well because we were opening the button with like a lot of more like low suited connectors and suited gappers where our opponent would 3-bet his. We're also opening with a lot of overpairs where his opponent will 3-bet his. So the hands that kind of connect on this board, unless they're sets, and sets are rare, but the hands that connect really well on this board for the most part are like suited connectors, suited gappers, and overpairs. Those are all in the button opening range. Additionally, position's really, really valuable here, which allows us to bet really aggressively, which I think is explained in the next slide. So, if we bet half pot on this flop, our opponent will need to call 66.7% of the time to prevent us from profitably bluffing with any 2 cards. This is not likely possible. So, every hand will be plus EV because our opponent will fold more than 33.3% of the time, and when he calls, we'll have equity. So remember, your opponent the big blind does not need to defend aggressively enough on the flop to prevent us from being able to profitably bet any 2 cards on the button. We have a much stronger range than our opponent on most board textures, and we have a big advantage for being in position. So a lot of times we can make a plus EV bet with any hand in our range, and that's what usually encourages people to bet the button too much because they don't realize sometimes checking is more profitable than betting. So here, if we bet like half pot, the opponent will need to defend 2/3 of the time to prevent us from being able to profitably bluff with any two cards, and that's just not likely. So let's talk about that key question. Are any hands more profitable to check than bet? Ideally, we'd like to check with hands which have showdown value, hate getting check raised, and aren't afraid to give free cards. But remember, the board was 6-5-2 with a flush draw, so no such hand exists here. There's no hand which both has showdown value, hates getting check raised, and isn't afraid to give free cards. There's some hands that have 2 of the 3 here, but very rarely do any hands have all three of these qualities here. In fact, I'd encourage you to visualize the problem in the following way. Assume you can have either strong, marginal, or weak hands on the flop. So imagine you have a strong hand, and you can use whatever strong hand you want, but like pocket 8s or better is usually going to qualify as a strong hand. You could even say queen 6 for top pair with a good kicker, and I would say that's a strong hand too. So are you going to want to check any of those hands? Nope. There's too much value in betting, and you don't want to give free cards, which can cause us to lose value or get outdrawn. So if we check a hand like pocket 8s, all the time the turn card is going to be an overcard, and then we're going to have either lost value if our opponent has like a 6 or a 5, or we might have been outdrawn. So it's really, really risky to check an overpair like 8s or 9s or 10s here. Likewise, if we have like a set or a straight, when we check back, we remove a street from the game. So if we did have like our opponent overset, or if our opponent had 2 pair and we have a straight, it's really risky to check because we can lose a bunch of value. So you're just never really going to want to check a strong hand here. You end up giving a free card, which is pretty risky, and you usually will frequently end up losing value. So are any medium strength hands going to check? And so for a medium strength hand, you might imagine like a pair of 5s, maybe some random pairs of 6s, something like that. Probably not. There are few, if any, medium strength hands which don't mind giving free cards. I'm going to discuss possible exceptions in a minute. For example, 6x and 5x hands hate giving free cards. So again, think of the board texture. It's 6-5-2 with a flush draw. Yeah, a 6x or a 5x hand is probably like a medium strength hand, especially if we don't have like a 6 with a good kicker. But those hands hate giving free cards. So usually if we have a medium strength hand that hates giving free cards, we want to bet the earlier streets and check the later streets. That's exactly what I'd want to do with something like Jack 5 suited here. I'd want to bet the flop, and then depending on what the turn is, but I'd likely check the turn and then try to get to showdown after I either get my opponent to call with a worse hand on the flop by, because betting Jack 5 will usually have the opponent call with some worse hands on the flop, and I can make some overcards fold. So pretty much any 5x hand, I want to bet on the flop and then likely check the turn. So my medium strength hands, not really going to be checking here. So will weak hands want to check? Again, probably not. We can make a plus EV bet on the flop now, and we're betting all of our strong hands. So if we had like an air type hand, like let's just say we had a complete air ball on the flop. So we had like, let's say we had queen 7. That hand can make a plus EV bet on the flop because the opponent's going to be folding too much. And now we're betting it in a range where we would already bet all of our strong hands. So if our opponent does call our flop bet and we have something like queen 7, we can kind of, be confident our opponent's not very strong on a lot of turns, and that will allow us to like double barrel pretty effectively. So again, this is an oversimplification, but hopefully you can see why I want to bet all the strong hands here, because I want to get value now and I don't want to get outdrawn. I want to bet my medium strength hands because I'd rather bet the earlier streets and deny my opponent free cards and check later rather than check the flop and then bet the later streets. So it's like the opposite of if I were to have like an ace with a really weak kicker on an ace high board. If I had ace 2 when the flop comes like ace 10, 7, I might want to check back my ace 2 on the flop. I could also bet it, but I might want to check it back, give my opponent a free card. I'm not that afraid of getting outdrawn. Exact opposite here. My medium strength hands, which are like 6x and 5x, very vulnerable to being outdrawn by hands in my opponent's check folding range, so I'd rather bet them on the flop and check later. And then the weak hands just kind of want to bet because we can profitably bet with any 2 cards. And if our opponent does call our flop bet, we're going to be able to double barrel effectively on some turn cards. And if we do get check raised on the flop, we just don't care if we have to fold queen 7 to a flop check raise. It's like whatever. So that's why I'm pretty much going to be betting everything. So while there may be some decent hands to check on the flop, let's say ace 10, for example, there aren't really any slam dunk awesome flop checks. So I actually do kind of like a flop check with ace 10 on this 6-5-2 board. Because of this, And because it's so hard for the big blind to check call, I'd rather bet our entire range here for about 0.5 pot size bets. This reduces the effectiveness of his check raises and doesn't let him see free cards. Now, I know I just mentioned I kind of like a flop check with ace 10, but now I'm also saying I bet my entire range, so let's explain that. So in theory, I imagine there is some really small flop checking back range, since I do think hands like ace-jack, ace-10, and ace-9 may work well as checks, and this can be balanced. It also might be good if we don't bet literally our entire range on the flop. I'm not sure, but it might be. But the problem is I don't care enough to spend time to learn how to balance this. Even ace-jack, ace-10, and ace-9, I'm not sure those are better flop checks than flop bets. So if I think it's really, really close, even though these, ace-jack and ace-10 do have some qualities that I really like in a check. I don't like getting check raised when I hold ace-10. I like keeping my opponent's dominated 10s and aces in the hand when I check. So even though I do like checking ace-10 for a lot of reasons, I don't really want to design a flop checking back range. I'm not even sure it's better to check ace-10 than it is to bet, because if I bet ace-10, I also feel like I can confidently keep value betting the turn if the turn's an ace or a 10. So this just looks like a spot where it's easier to always bet and just move on with my life, because learning how to balance a checking back range on a 6-high board just doesn't seem worth it when I feel like I already understand why I like betting almost everything. So this would be, if I were to try to learn how to do this, this would be the opposite of that pick the lowest hanging fruit mentality that I like to really stress. That fruit's really high up there, so I'm just going to leave it there. So I like to think that I'm reasonably open in videos. Like, I know I'm not like this world-class player. So for me personally, if I'm just trying to make a decent hourly while getting better while enjoying poker, I want to just pick the lowest hanging fruit and get better that way. I'm not worried about learning how to do some really intricate flop checking range on a 6-5-2 board. Because I also don't want to, I don't want to just check back these ace-high hands on the flop. So I would need to figure out other hands to put in that range. And again, I just don't think it's worth it. So for this board texture, I would just go ahead and literally bet 100% of your range on the button. So this video has been going for about an hour, and I haven't even gone through half of my hand examples. So when I made the slides, I thought I'd be able to get through this whole video in an hour. But what I've learned is when I'm intentionally going over a lot of hand examples and I'm intentionally picking a lot of really close and difficult spots, it's a lot harder for me to discuss because I just have a harder time, phrasing things exactly how I want to phrase them and making a clear point. And it's also a lot more time consuming. So I'm going to save those 4 hands for the next video. In all likeliness, I'll have completed the next video before I get to read your feedback. But let me know what you think about this kind of format with regards to going over some easy examples and some close examples. Because one thing that's always really hard for me to do is if I pick the easiest examples, it might most clearly illustrate a point and make things a little bit easier to understand. But then I don't want things to seem really simple in a video. And then when you go play real life poker, you actually get into a lot of close spots where there's a lot of arguments for both betting and checking. So I'm hoping this video did kind of both. It showed the easy examples and the tough examples. So whatever you kind of prefer, you got what you wanted. But let me know overall what you think about that, because I know when I explained myself, I wasn't as clear as I would have been if I only picked easier stuff. So just give me your feedback on that. Again, we're going to go over another 4 examples in the next video. And I hope you enjoyed watching this one and learned a bit. We're going to go over a bunch more different board textures. So hopefully this will all come together a little bit more in the next video. Thanks for watching and good luck at the tables. Take care, everyone.